As any Disney fan will long already know, in the 2010s, Disney became somewhat obsessed with having twist villains in their movies, and it was a trend that many quickly got tired of, both because it became very predictable and because it arguably started detracting from their movie's given narrative rather than adding to it. And as I got into in a separate video, which you can find a link in the description to, there are many who debate as to which villain from that era actually started the trend. And while that video stuck to trying to answer that question based off the era of the Disney twist villain, today I'd like to do something slightly different and go over who could be considered the actual first twist villain the company ever made, and it's one that goes all the way back to the time of Walt Disney. And there are going to be spoilers for the movie in question ahead, so in case you'd like to watch it for yourself first and don't want to know what happens, you should probably turn off the video. There aren't going to be any other spoiler warnings in this video. Alright. So to cut right to the chase, the movie with the distinction of being the first Disney movie with a twist villain would actually be The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Now, just a few weeks ago I did another video talking about this movie's villain, which you can also find a link in the description to. But the thing is, in that video, I was talking about the villain from the Ichabod, or the Legend of Sleepy Hollow segment of it. And this video is to discuss the Mr. Toad, or the Wind in the Willows section. And in case you have no idea what I'm talking about, in the 1940s, Disney made quite a few what are known as package movies, which basically took unrelated stories and connected them together through a framing device to make for a complete film without there having to be a single narrative throughout. Almost like a watered down version of Fantasia or The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. And in this case, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad are two completely unrelated stories based off the books The Wind in the Willows and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, respectively, with what happens in one segment having no bearing on the other. But I'm getting off topic here. The point is, in the Wind in the Willows segment of The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is an aristocratic owner of a highly regarded estate called Toad Hall, who suffers from what's known as manias. Basically, he has an obsession with whatever the latest kind of adventure is, and isn't exactly careful with them either. And this culminates in him developing an obsession with the newly introduced automobile. But due to his reckless driving of his previous horse and carriage, he can't afford to buy one. So when he's found with a stolen car, everybody believes he took it to satisfy his obsession, which is only further backed up by a bartender who claims Mr. Toad tried to sell him the stolen car. But after managing to escape from jail, Mr. Toad's friends realized that it was the bartender named Mr. Winky and his weasel henchman who stole the car and then sold it to Mr. Toad in exchange for Toad Hall, meaning he had been telling the truth all along. And from there, the rest of the story centers on clearing Mr. Toad's name by reclaiming the deed to Toad Hall. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this plot twist works very effectively. The first of which being, it can come as a genuine surprise. Though Mr. Winky doesn't exactly look like the most honest fellow, even if what Mr. Toad says would suggest otherwise, it would still be very in character for Toad to steal somebody's car in an impulsive need to satisfy his motor mania, to the point that even his friends don't believe him when he says he didn't steal it. And not to mention, the one friend who was there and claims Mr. Toad bought the car fair and square is just as bad as he is. So it makes it appear all the more likely that he just made it up to help his friend out. But the other thing that makes the twist so surprising is that even people who've read the book, The Wind in the Willows, is likely to be taken off guard by it, if not even more so than those who haven't. Because here's the thing. In the book, there is no Mr. Winky, and Mr. Toad actually did steal the car. But despite that, things pretty much otherwise play out the same way. After spending some time in jail, Toad is eventually able to escape with the help of an accomplice, makes it back to his friends, who tell him that a bunch of weasels have inhabited his house during his absence, and after chasing them off, everybody lives happily ever after, with Mr. Toad never paying any additional consequences for stealing the car or escaping from jail for a crime he did commit. As a result, it can feel as if he gets off completely scot-free, even though he was guilty and did arguably belong in jail. So hence in the Disney version, the character of Mr. Winky is introduced in order to make Mr. Toad more sympathetic by having him be framed and sent to jail for a crime he didn't commit, therefore making his escape somewhat justified. And once one knows he's innocent, it's impossible not to want to see his name be cleared. To put it simply, by adding a twist villain to the story, it allows events to play out the way they do in the book, while making Mr. Toad much easier to root for. And there's also the fact that by having Mr. Winky and the Weasels steal the car and then sell it to Mr. Toad in exchange for Toad Hall also helps tighten the narrative. Because as I noted before, in the book, the Weasels are just random squatters that took over Mr. Toad's house because nobody was looking after it. But in the Disney version, it makes more sense for them to be there because he gave them Toad Hall in exchange for the car. And it also serves as a motivation for them to want to frame him in the first place. Because one has to admit, washing your hands of a stolen vehicle and acquiring a mansion in one fell swoop is a pretty great deal for a gang of thieves. And finally, because of all that extra context, it allows the climactic fight between the Weasels and Mr. Toad's friends to have a lot more weight and stakes behind it beyond just getting rid of a bunch of squatters. Now, obviously none of this is to take away from the original novel, The Wind in the Willows, as it's still considered a classic piece of British literature. The only point I'm trying to make here is why Mr. Winky was added to the Disney adaptation of the story, as well as how his addition actually makes for a pretty effective villain. Because once again, he has his goons steal a car, then is able to trade it for a mansion, and frame Mr. Toad so easily that everybody, including very likely the audience, believes him to be guilty. And it's only through Toad's quick thinking and resourcefulness that he's able to stop and expose him. And one has to admit, that's not bad for a villain that wasn't even in the book. And honestly, in this case, it was actually smart to hide the fact that Mr. Winky was behind the car's theft, so that it would leave the audience wondering as to whether or not Mr. Toad was guilty, rather than know right from the beginning that Toad was framed. Because the way the story is structured, it wouldn't have worked as well if the audience immediately knew Mr. Toad was innocent and Mr. Winky was lying through his teeth. Though it's still not too hard to guess where it's all going, but the lingering uncertainty is a lot more effective than immediately knowing what really happened. But what's also funny about all this is, despite being pretty much the first villain in a Disney movie to be revealed via plot twist, Mr. Winky manages to get everything right that a lot of the later Disney twist villains were accused of getting wrong. because, among other things, the twist doesn't come out of nowhere and is foreshadowed to the point that some might say they wouldn't trust him by appearance alone. His personality is consistent both before and after the reveal, and he majorly contributes to the narrative by not only making Mr. Toad sympathetic, but also making the story tighter by giving the Weasels a reason to be at Toad Hall and fight to keep it. So once again, not only is the twist that he's the bad guy a rather effective one, all things considered, but his inclusion arguably makes the story better because it fixes or improves on potential problems with the source material. But as I touched on earlier, as just a twist villain and nothing else, Mr. Winky probably isn't the best example of it out there, since it's not so much that the truth comes out of nowhere, and more that it clears up the uncertainty of whether or not Mr. Toad was telling the truth. But once again, given how Mr. Toad is presented, along with the fact that even his friends don't believe him, does help make the twist more effective, if more for the fact that Mr. Toad is innocent rather than Mr. Winky being the bad guy. But as I just said, when it comes to what he has to contribute to the narrative, Mr. Winky might actually be one of the best examples of a twist villain in the entire Disney animated canon, and a character that a few of those twist villains from the 2010s could have learned quite a bit from. Okay, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that Mr. Winky from The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is not only the first true plot twist villain Disney ever created, but one of their better and more effective ones to boot? Or do you believe I'm giving him way too much credit? Or had you never even heard of him before you watched this video? Whatever the case, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind, you do not have to agree with this video just because you watched it. You can feel about Disney twist villains and Mr. Winky however you want to, and if you think I had it all wrong, that's completely fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all really appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.